Hey guys, welcome to the recap video of game number 3 in the World Championship match. This game was super interesting, and I thought in the opening there were many different ways that the game could have gone and many different strategies that could have been employed. So I really want to dive deep into the opening stage of this game. So Nepo had the white pieces, Magnus with the black ones, and we see a similar opening to really what happened last time. I mean, this is the most theoretical that there is basically with a4 here. I mean, instead of a4, white has many options. I mean, there's c3, which is, of course has gone down in popularity, but is still playable. But typically this just dries out into a drawn position. There's d3, there's even d4, h3, and a4, of course. So a4, trying to spice it up on the queen side and create some weaknesses that are later going to be able to become targets. Now here bishop e7, defending the rook, very key. If the a file were to ever open up, the rook must be defended here. Now d3, and of course staying very solid. Now one of the key maneuvers here is not to move the knight to c3, where it's a little bit awkward. There's cases where b4 is a little annoying, but rather to use this newly opened d2 square and maneuver the knight towards f1, where it can come into the game. Now the move d6 was played. Knight to d2, rook to e8, knight to f1. This is all very normal. And after h6, which is, again, very, very normal, here I think is already an interesting moment. So bishop d2 was played here, which super solid. The point is to dominate this knight, right? Take away key squares from it. And knight a5 and c5 is one of the most typical ideas in this sort of structure for black, getting a huge amount of space on the queen side. So bishop d2 is a great way to restrict all of that, especially because you've already developed your other knight. You don't really need the d2 square, so I thought this was a very just instructive move. Doesn't seem like it's doing a lot, but if knight a5 was allowed in c5, the whole game could have changed and white could have gone into a more defensive state. So bishop d2, bishop to f8, opening up the rook, and there's always cases where this center can open up, so it's nice to have just the luxury of the rook seeing this center e4 and e5. And there's also cases where g6 is played and the bishop can even fianchetto. Now here knight to e3 was played, which is super interesting, and I think this is actually part of Nepo's opening preparation, because knight to g3 is, I think, much more natural. You're keeping the rook open, and realistically, where would the knight go from both of these squares? To f5. True, on g3, in cases it can come to h5, and on e3, in cases it can come to d5, but on d5, you don't really want to trade pieces here as white if you're going for an advantage, and on h5, I mean, it's quite unrealistic that it will really get there. So typically, you're probably going to f5. So why would you choose one over the other? Well, typically you go to g3 because you want to keep the rook open here. The more open your pieces are, just naturally, the better results you'll get. And so this move is what I think I was expecting, I think a lot of people were expecting, but knight to e3, and the purpose of this move is actually revealed in a couple of moves later. So here knight to e7 was played, which is very, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, opening up the bishop, and also you want to move the knight at some point to have the ability to play c5 and just be able to push your c-pawn. And now a really nice move was played. So this position was already reached quite a lot, and this next move, only 6 games actually were played. The top player was Fiddler, I think 26 something, and the move is c4. And this idea of pushing the c-pawn and the a-pawn and creating so much tension with this b5 pawn is super instructive. So what's going on here? Well, first of all, what can black do? Well, if they take, then you take with the bishop, and this is very disastrous because this a6 pawn is a massive weakness, and I mean, white's just going to pile up resources in many, many ways, also maneuvering the knights over to attack this pawn. This pawn will probably fall at some point, and then white's going to have a very nice position on the queen side. So that was not really an option. Now in this specific case, b4 was not an option because white can simply take the pawn. There was some interesting strategical ideas here. You can maybe go c5 and then a5 immediately. And the idea of the last two moves were to stop these pawns from pushing, meaning that this bishop is totally stuck. So you give away a pawn, but render this bishop basically useless currently, while this bishop has much more potential along this new diagonal that it can reroute to. And that is true, but I don't know if it's worth a pawn. I mean, everything is temporary in chess, and this pawn and this bishop here could in the future give white many moves. This knight moves out, the bishop can even come to f3, maybe self-fianchetto in some cases, so I don't know if this would have been worth the pawn, and Magnus did not think it was, and instead took on c4. And taking on c4 leaves white with two options, really, taking with the bishop or the knight, and most people, I think, would take with the bishop, leaving this diagonal open, setting up a lot of tactics. So, for example, if they were to just move their knight, or really play most moves, well, bishop takes f7 is very much possible with this fork in the end. So you have to be super careful if this bishop is opened up on the king. But Nepo took with the knight. And this is the purpose of moving the knight over to e3. You want to have the ability to take with the knight. And this seems super weird, but Nepo played for a lot of queenside play. Rather than going for this tactical idea on the king side, Nepo instead wanted to create a lot of weaknesses and target them. So he in general just puts a lot more control on this a5 square, and in the future, a5 is probably played by black to get some space and stop a5 from white, and then it becomes a massive weakness, and this is exactly what happened. And so I think this is a huge strategic moment. Do you go for a much more tactical play and aiming towards the king side more, or do you play it more slowly, more positionally, and perhaps go for attacks on the queen side and create weaknesses on the queen side? So I thought this was quite nice. Another thing you should also be aware of is there is tactics to sacrifice here twice, and because in the end there's some potentially unstoppable threats on f7, so that is also a nice tactical idea that is created. Okay, so knight to c6 was played, and I think this is a decent move, I mean a great move, because you're bringing the knight back to the queen side, which is important. If you ignore the queen side here and neglect to defend it properly and worry more about the king side, then white will get too much play along the c-file with this a5 square. The bishop can come to a5, pinning the pawn, and then there's so many more threats on c7. So it was nice to bring more defenders into the game. Rook to c1 anyways, of course, putting the rook on a much better square. a5, and now a very nice strategic idea by white. You move the knight over here, you induced a5, and now, and a5 was kind of induced because otherwise, like I mentioned, you want to get a piece here and create more pressure on this pawn, or with the knight perhaps on the bishop. So a5 was kind of a must here, but now it's a pretty big target, and white played bishop c3 with a very direct plan of going queen d2 and simply taking the pawn. And this was maybe the most interesting moment for black, because black has two ways to get out of this, and they employed a really interesting pawn sacrifice, and we've already seen some pawn sacrifices from Magnus in this World Championship, and he goes ahead for another one here, but I quickly want to mention a more composed option, which would have been queen to b8. And after queen d2, going for the pawn, queen a7, and this seems super awkward from black's point of view, because you're tying down, it seems, all of your pieces to a5. How are you going to get any play? But really what this does is puts the ball in white's court and says, well, okay, my pieces are tied down, but yours are as well. All you're doing is putting pressure on a5, which I have very much secured here. How are you going to get any more play in the position? And that is a very valid question, because all of the play has been on the queen side thus far, and it's not so easy to really create weaknesses or go for weaknesses on the king side, where black has this really solid setup here with, again, like I mentioned, the ideas of maybe going g7 with the bishop. So it's a super interesting play, really would have slowed down the game and created many questions for the players to answer, and I really would have been interested to see how they dealt with this position, but that is not what happened, and instead bishop c8 was played here with the idea of this. After queen d2, which is exactly the idea that most people would play here, black was prepared to just give away this pawn. There's not a great way to defend it, actually. And black was probably going to play bishop e6, with the idea that you're creating some annoying pins here. So after knight takes a5, bishop takes b3, knight takes, rook takes a4, materially we've equalized, but white could have gone maybe a slight edge with this really nice idea, knight to a5, practically trapping this rook, and now black really has to worry of ideas like b3. And so here, something like queen to a8, just to show you how quickly the dangers can occur, queen to a8 would be a massive blunder, because if knight takes, and hey, we have a rook on c1, we have a queen on c6, we can simply take on e5, for example. And so you have to be super careful in this position, but black could have gone away from this with knight takes a5, bishop takes a5, and even though it's true that this rook is maybe not so comfortable here because of the position of it, it doesn't have many squares, there's not a great way to trap it, and black can actually play, for example, queen b8 here, trying to make moves like b3 less possible, trying to send more units to the queen side and not really worry about this pawn on c7, because if it's taken, then something like queen b5 can be played, and black can end up sacrificing a pawn here with the idea that in that time, black has sent many units over to the queen side, and even up a pawn, black has great chances to just draw this game, get the other pieces to the queen side. I mean, black has totally dominated the queen side, and for example, b2 is a pretty big weakness here. So that would have been an interesting way for the game to go, with that rook semi-trapped, you could say. But instead of queen d2, white did a super nice strategical idea here. They basically said this, bishop c8, it kind of undevelops the bishop. And now look at how many pieces are on the back rank for white. I've got to use this, and you know, there's this idea where if your opponent is super passive, you need a strike. And here, that's exactly what white tried to do. They striked in the center with d5. This is a beautiful strategical idea, a strategical principle that Nepo used. Now after d4, black took, knight takes, and the queen ends on d4, and this looks super scary, this position of all of these pieces, but black remained calm and played bishop e6, and it turns out this pin is really annoying. If the knight were to ever move, then bishop takes b3 would leave the a4 pawn super weak, like we already saw in that other line. And so even though white seems and should be better in this position, just by the amount of space they have, by the amount of developments, it's really hard to actually shape a winning attack. And that is what Nepo found out here, because he spent, I think, maybe 20 minutes, maybe even more. I mean, I was watching this live, and he just kept on thinking, and he couldn't find any ideas. Rook d1 is a nice calm move, maybe going for e5 and then trying to get pressure on the d file, but that would really only lead to trades. You can try to set up in some ways this attack along this file, but black can very easily defend that. I mean, it takes a lot of moves to set up that attack, so that wouldn't have been that dangerous. And white just found out that, you should be better, but there's not a great way to actually make use of this advantage that you have with this extra development and space. And so white played, after a very long think, the very calm h3 move here. Just giving back the move to black, giving some space to the king, which is always useful, and basically saying that white doesn't know how to proceed. Let's see what black does and go from there. Now c6 was played here, a very nice move, defending the pawn on a5, so it's much harder to take it, and also preparing perhaps d5. I mean, c5 just controls, or c6 just controls more of the fifth rank, and d5 could be a possible idea in the future. Now bishop c2 is played. White does try to go for this attack along the diagonal, but as you'll see, it's just not so fruitful this late in the game, because even though black is underdeveloped, black is still super solid in the king side, and it's hard to take advantage of this position. Now d5 was played, and now this basically led to a mass trade, because of e5, you lose your knight, trade off the queen, and then win back the knight. Bishop to b4 leads to even more trades of pieces, and we're left in this really simple endgame, basically. I mean, up until here, both of the players spent hours on this position, and then in this endgame, they spent maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes to end the game, because it's a very simple draw here. Even though two pawns connected are better than two pawns stacked, the difference here is so small, especially if you keep the bishops on the board. And let's actually see how black got the draw here. So first trading off the rooks here, and as long as you keep the bishops on the board here, you're totally fine, because simply the bishop on the board will allow you to keep more pressure on the position and tie down white's pieces, and this is exactly what Magnus does. So he played f4 here first of all, making this pawn here less of a target for this bishop, then played c5, a super nice move, opening up the diagonal along here, and after bishop c2, bishop d7, we see exactly how you're supposed to draw this position. You tie down your opponent's bishop to a very passive defense of this pawn on a4, and you also make advancements on the king side much harder to get away with. G3, which typically could be possible, you drop maybe the pawn on h3 here. So in general, we come to this just very safe position for both players, and Nepo understood that this is a dead draw here, so he played the move f3, basically cutting life from this position, stopping any pawn breaks with g3 or g4, and agreeing to a draw practically. We see a couple more moves, just shuffling the kings basically, and eventually the handshake occurred and a draw was agreed. So the endgame, I think, was a little boring, albeit still instructive, but really this middle game structure and this middle game strategic difference that could have occurred from what actually happened in the game in many areas with this queen to a7 maneuver, super interesting, with this queen d2 idea, where in the end the rook kind of becomes trapped by white's bishop or knight that lands on a5. So the game could have gone in some interesting paths, and I thought this was a very interesting game, even though on the surface it looks quite boring. So this was game number 3. Hopefully you enjoyed this recap. Subscribe if you're new around here, and I will see you next time. Peace out.